Okay, welcome. You missed the prayer because I forgot to push the recording button, people. But we're gathered again. We're at our halfway mark through our 8 series of webinars on emerging models of the church, especially smaller churches that are in fragile situations, seeking to discern their faithful ways forward. We've had an awful lot of fun with them. I get an awful lot of emails and messages from people on Facebook and stuff who are telling me that their people are watching this recorded webinar and woke up to an idea that they didn't know existed before, or they want to dig deeper and everything. I will tell you that I went ahead in the chat room, I put in the link to our online link to both the schedule for the rest of the webinars that we have going forward. They go up until Thursday, November 17th, or every Thursday in this time slot. And we quit the week before Thanksgiving. And then also, if you scroll down on that page that it takes you to the recorded posted videos of each prior one. So if you want to watch any of the old ones too. I'm excited about the one today because I think it has a breadth of potential. I had people say, what do you mean buildingless churches? And it can mean a lot of things. It can, and we have purposefully represented the spectrum with our invited guests today, as we're calling them peer practitioners. We go from a church that is always, only, and ever online or buildingless. It could be that they're event oriented, but not with building and property and things like that. Brett Webb Mitchell is going to represent us in that one, and I'll give his intro in a little bit. And the other is Orlando Carr from the Presbyterian Foundation. And I hate to always tell people, how come you don't know all the resources there are at presbyterianfoundation.org? They are, to me, the best of what we've got in the denomination. I will even go so far as to say, and I'm a little biased because I used to sit on their board for about 8 years, several decades ago. But they're the best of saying, here's a niche of service and resourcing that the church needs that they probably don't have the bandwidth in the PMA to address, and we're going to address it. And so the toolkits that they have are models for me of how to deal with churches of your sizes, and opening up just sort of a window of imagination and finding out. And so with that, let me start by giving you a little in depth on each of them. Brett Webb Mitchell is a Presbyterian minister. He has theology degrees from Princeton and Harvard, and his PhD from Chapel Hill. I will maybe forgive him for that because he went from there and eventually ended up on the faculty at my alma mater across the way, teaching Christian nurture at Duke Divinity School. He's pastored many small, diverse churches in the Methodist vein and in the Presbyterian and others, I'm sure, Lutheran, I should say too. He's the author of several books focusing on accessibility to Christian growth, the practice of pilgrimage, and what it means to be a gay parent. I said to you, I was waiting for him to slide in here today and hoping he was in the right time zone, because he just, like hours ago, got back into the United States from his honeymoon with his husband in Portugal. So we're glad, congratulations again, and we're glad to have you here and somewhat awake, I'm sure.
Thanks.
He's focusing a lot these days on the practicing of pilgrimage, and that will enter into his story about buildingless churches when we get to his story and listening to it. Orlando Carr is the Senior Ministry Relations Officer for the East Region in the Presbyterian Foundation. Don't say it to anyone else that I know well, but he is my favorite of all the MROs that I've worked with. I've done it in several parts of the country. He's based in Charlotte. And more recently, I guess this maybe started during COVID, Orlando, I'm not sure, when you and Robert Hayes sort of got bumped into the Project Regeneration venue of working on a series of modules that really address a lot of stuff deeply. I was saying to some who were on here early, I worked with a church just last night here in my own area that was clueless about what was possible with their building and how to find out anything about what was possible. So I'm excited to have Orlando here to talk about that whole breadth of the spectrum of incredible creative ideas and also resources. I use the toolbox stuff all the time there with my churches. With that, we're going to start with a short poll that I'm going to remember to put up. See, I could have forgotten that too. My techie sidekick, Jim Kitchens, is on an airplane coming home from Dallas right now. So Mark Liller is very tech savvy and agreed to be my co-host and keep me in line, which I am very pleased for. So I'm just launching a quick poll for you to, for those who are unfamiliar with the polls, you just scroll down. There are 2 questions. The first question is single choice. Oh, I meant to make the second one multiple choice. Darn. Oh, no. Oh, I did. This is the wrong poll one. We're on 7, Buildingless Churches. There we go. The first question is a single choice. The second question, you answer as many as apply to you. And we're trying to get a sense of who is our audience, what exposure do they have, or what interest level are they at? And in the second one, it's saying, what would you like as follow-up to the series that we're doing? So go ahead and answer those. I'll give you a minute or 2 while you're doing that. And we'll give a plug for next week's while you're answering those too. Come on, folks. Nobody's participating. Can you see it?
It looks like it's the results and not the
no, because it doesn't say end poll yet. So it didn't. No, people are weighing in now. I'm beginning to see the.
Yep.
So let me say quickly that next week's is got a weird title that somebody again are saying, huh? About, we call it tipping the scales when we've worked with it in PneuMatrix, but it's often the parlance that's used is parallel starts. Typically it's an aging congregation that is losing energy and is in somewhat of a decline and maybe doesn't have the energy to do what needs to happen in the community as a church of witness there. And so instead of sort of going away and losing their, or trying to say, let's bring in some folks that do worship and everything completely different from us, and I don't want to sit through that worship because I'm an old dog and I don't want a new trick in my life, is that you set up an intentional parallel situation of a new worshiping community, some new form of version, usually younger, that is working alongside of them with the intention that eventually the scales will tip and that younger blossoming nest will take over the governance and take over the property as you age out. And it's a graceful way to make that move for some churches. And so we'll hear about folks that are working on those. Okay, I think
without commas.
I'm sorry. If you could mute yourselves, or I'll ask Mark to mute you guys so I don't have any background noise in this. All but one person has voted, and that would be me. So I'm going to go ahead and end the poll and show the results. All right. Boy, we don't have many. We don't have many who are doing buildingless work. We only have maybe, and maybe that's you. You're one of the 19 Brad, that clicked that one. So you're holding that fort down for us. But we have a lot of people who are interested in saying, how does this buildingless church thing work, and what's the variety of ways it can. And then in terms of, let me scroll down and see what you want. Yeah, you're following suit. Most of you are saying, to be perfectly honest, we thought at the beginning of this grant that we would be trying to structure ongoing cohorts, and we are with the part-time clergy. But in terms of the emerging models, we got 2 responses back. One is, I'm honestly cohorted out in my ministry. I'm already involved in several cohorts. And number 2, and more importantly, I still want to be part of the thread of discussion and resourcing for several of these models, and I can't be in a cohort of each one of them. So if we would focus on the models of either Facebook or especially the toolkit model, which frankly will be like the toolbox of the foundation in terms of structure, I think, but to approach it for having something that's there forever. We just haven't figured out where to lodge that yet. I was asking Olanda about the woman who was heading a division I would have approached to and say, this probably belongs in your bailiwick. She just took a job as a dean at Columbia Seminary. So I don't know who's going to come in and fill that gap, but maybe if I catch them early enough, they'll like the idea. Okay, so we know who we are. So I'm going to go back to asking each of our guests to tell us a little bit of story of how you fit into this model, what's the experience that you bring to it, and the stories of ministries you've been involved in with it. Brett, why don't you start for us?
Okay, how many minutes do I get to do this?
I'll start yelling you at about 12.
Okay, good. So, currently I am the organizing pastor of what we call the Community of Pilgrims Presbyterian Fellowship here in Portland, Oregon. We're a 1001 new worshiping community We have gone through all the monies that we can, and now we are quote unquote self-sustaining. We are 5 years old. The average length of stay for a new worshiping community is usually 3 years before either the community kind of folds in on itself or becomes merged with another church or another religious entity. So we seem to be doing pretty well. We have just adopted or adapted to doing a hybrid model after going through COVID for 2 years, in which we went totally Zoom, and now we meet in place as well as Zoom in place in a church. So the beginning of the community of pilgrims, just take it first, pilgrimage. When I taught at Duke Divinity School, I had a group of friends, Catholic, who said, having read 3 of my books with people with disabilities, in which I talked about people with disabilities as being stuck in the middle of the public square, in which the church, the pub, no one was welcoming them in a medieval square in a public space. And my friends, Catholic friends, said, "You write really pretty things about pilgrimage. Too bad you've never been on one." So with that, because that was always the joy of being in academia, you could write about these things and be an expert without having to do it. So my first pilgrimage in 1999 was to Chimayo in northern New Mexico. I was the lone gringo, or as they called me, the loco gringo. Presbyterian on a very Catholic pilgrimage, 6 days, 120 miles from Costilla, northern New Mexico to Chimayo. And that did it. I started to change my understanding of what is education in the life of the church, having taken John Westerhoff's position at Duke Divinity School. And what I started to look at was the life of pilgrimage, having written already in my book, Christly Gestures, that the body of Christ is the way that we are to understand ourselves as this assembly of people. And so I looked a lot at Paul and what Paul was writing and what Paul had said about being the body of Christ, realizing when we began, in fact, zip 20 years down the road, when we began the community of pilgrims, the first 2 months we spent in the book of Acts of the Apostles. And what is foundational to Acts of the Apostles is there was no church building. There was no janitor. There was no raising of church funds to build a structure. Everyone was meeting in homes, by riverbeds, by trees, in synagogues and things like that. There was nothing that had to do with the building. And so we began the community of pilgrims with that. And I had already written about the earliest community of the church being the body of Christ. Actually, and that's why the book was called Christly Gestures, was to figure out what were the gestures of being Christian in the early community that we continue to practice today. The first time I had this is my second new church development. The first time I fell into it in the Presbytery of New Hope, we started the old-fashioned way of starting a church, and that was, there was a mother church. In this case, it was White Memorial Presbyterian Church in Raleigh, that was going to be the mother church for a small church called Davis Drive. I think it's now called Cornerstone Presbyterian Church in Cary, North Carolina, in which we got all our money and all our resources. And even though we carried the church in the trunk of someone's car, we had the cross, we had the cup, we had the bowl for baptism. Nevertheless, it was always understood that the goal of this new church development was to buy land and build a building. This time, I took my cues from what's called New Creation Presbyterian Church in Greensboro, started by Frank Dew, who was a Presbyterian clergy, but also a chaplain to Greensboro Urban Ministry, and quite the prophet in that part of North Carolina, in which they began, having studied Church of the Savior, Sojourner Community, and I had experience in large Benedictine models, Camp Hill, as well as Koinonia Farms. They began, and thus we followed them, with the idea of becoming an intentional Christian community in which we practice service and fellowship, education, discipleship, prayer and worship as we follow Jesus and embrace all. You'll notice nowhere in that did we decide we're going to build a building along with that. Instead, what we did was what New Creation Presbyterian Church did, was we rent space from, in our case, we rented from Rose City Park and now Rise Church, in which we meet from 4 to 6 in the afternoon. When all the other church programs have already happened on Sunday morning. We started with the idea of we'll do volunteer work out in the community in the Sunday morning, and then we'll meet in the afternoon. And we begin with time of devotion, as well as the sermon, as well as Eucharist weekly, and end up with a charcuterie board to die for, in which we have brought in people from outside of the streets to join us for fellowship and things like that. But the uniqueness was starting with this idea: we will be an intentional Christian community. Thus, we weren't going to become another Presbyterian church, another Presbyterian worshiping community, but we wanted to be an intentional Christian community that has worship, that has prayer, that has service, that has fellowship. So in the case of Rise Presbyterian Church, what did they get out of it, or how did they participate? Well, when they have to write out their report to the presbytery, what they are able to say is that they give us space. So whatever amount that they would charge to the 12-step program, that's how much they are going to head and donate to us as the community of pilgrims. So we pay nothing in terms of out of pocket to have that space, but the church gets to go ahead and say, we are supporting a Presbyterian service project here in our structure. So what's happened is we've been able to focus on relationships. And the beauty of starting an intentional Christian community is we're not focused on the programs. We are focused on building relationships with each other, as well as with other nonprofits in the area. Our first two niches in terms of what were the special service projects we were going with was first the LGBTQIA plus community, of which I'm a member of, in which there are still many who are looking for a spiritual home, a religious home, a faith community, as well as my background with people with disabilities. We started with the whole intention of working with a large community, as well as with people from the community that understands itself to be deaf, which is not quite being disability. And so we, as a community, actually started learning American Sign Language until the 3 people who are part of our community moved to Tucson out of Portland. And that kind of has not been picked up again. But it has been an exciting time. We have between 13, 14, 15, 20 people at any one time. This is including both Zoom, only Zoom, as well as Zoom and church at the same time. And we grow by we grow more, I think we're growing more in terms of numbers by word of mouth. Someone said to a older gentleman who's gay, who had not found a church community, to be in touch with Brett. And so what's happened is by word of mouth, we've slowly started to add more and more people to our gatherings. On Sunday, the community does 3 to 4 mission projects a year. And we're quite delighted with the growth. People are finding themselves having a deeper understanding of what the faith is, but also building relationships. And I think that's been incredibly important. We have young people who show up. We have people from all over the country continue to show up, from New York because of Zoom, because of that, we have people from New York to New Mexico to California who join us regularly on Sundays. So that's just a little bit about what we've been doing, and it seems to be thriving, and it seems to be working. And to balance my life out on Sunday morning, I am also the part-time pastor of a Lutheran congregation, ELCA congregation, that has a building. And I can tell you the difference, because the focus is, so what are we going to do about painting the church? What are we going to do about the stained glass windows? What are we going to do? So our focus is no longer on the relationships which we're able to focus upon in our relationship with Christ. Instead, much of the focus sometimes, some Sundays after church, happens to be on this building structure itself. And so the beauty has been with the community of pilgrims is that we've been able to really truly focus on our relationships. One last thing, my friend and co-writer extraordinaire, Kathleen Norris, I remember her saying to me, the beauty of the pilgrimage life is it is like monastic life on the road, monastic life on the road. And I think that's what we've tried to focus on, is having that monastic life on the road experience with each other. So From what I'm understanding from other presbyteries, this is the new way of being in the church. You know, the average size of many churches, 20, 25. Brian Heron, our presbytery exec, said, you know, there are 2 churches who are doing amazing things with 11 people. So I think not having to worry about a church structure has given us the freedom to focus on relationships. How's that?
It's good. Thank you, Brett. Let's go to the other end of the spectrum and talk with hear from Orlando about the notion of, if you're a church that has buildings, that has a campus, what things might enter into the realm of possibility for you to consider the best and highest use of that asset in ways that are building or building less. Orlando.
Sure. Just as a bit of context, I love the story that Brett just shared, because I think that is a wonderful example of the kind of work that we have been involved in at the Presbyterian Foundation. The Presbyterian Foundation umbrellas that work by the term Project Regeneration. And it actually began around 2013, and it focused mainly on just the transactional part of property. And as we were working with churches that were struggling with building maintenance and some of those very issues that Brett highlighted, as their membership perhaps became smaller, we noticed that it wasn't just about property, that in order to get to the location or to the place where you were able to sell something, you had to kind of go through what we call a discernment process just to get there. And so what we have done, as Deborah mentioned in the introduction, around 2020, which is a great time to roll out something new when the world was changing, we came up with a new model of Project Regeneration, where we focused heavily on helping our congregations discern what is it like to go through that decision-making process when you're looking at your property to decide what to do with it. We certainly will continue to assist you with the transactional part of it. But before we even get there, we think it's important that we get to know you a bit, meet with you, and go through an order of steps to help us. Generally, we will find that those decisions go into multiple categories. We like to say 7 categories when your church is facing an uncertain future. I believe that's how we word it. And sometimes the discernment activities will lead us that, you know what, thank you for your work, but we have decided with the resources that we have, we're going to stay as we are and do what we call age in place. It can sound unattractive, but sometimes, truthfully, that's what many of our churches are doing anyway, without engaging in this work. And if you make that decision consciously, it's better than making it unconsciously. And so we will work with you if that is your choice to do that. Other times it looks like doing something a little more dramatic or more bold in nature, such as sharing your campus or merging with another campus, or of course, selling some property, reinventing your ministry completely. Or perhaps we go through the work and you decide that maybe it is time to close and perhaps do exciting things with your assets and maybe even some of your property sales. And I'll get to that in a few moments as I talk about what some churches have done in that area. But to get us there, we go through a series of meetings with you, getting to know again some of the struggles that your particular church is facing. A lot of that looks like good old-fashioned analytics. We are the foundation. We did start in 1799, and we are kind of the financial people of the denomination. And so we definitely see the importance of looking at your financial health, looking at some of the nuances of that wonderful statistical report that we all love to complete. And what does that mean in terms of how is that governing the future of your church, where you are now, perhaps where you have been, and of course, definitely where you are going. We will also take that first gathering to listen to some of the concerns. It might be that roof, it might be the doors, it might be the windows, or it may be completely different issues. It could be that your community has drastically changed, or that your membership is aging at a rate that you don't see a lot of youth or young people coming in. whatever the concerns are, it is important for us to name them, to document them, because as we are developing what the plan will be to address them, we do need to know, of course, that information. In between our next gathering after that first meeting, that's where we will look at some of the financial health components of the church. We will ask the treasurer, the finance committee, the finance clerk, however you are organized within your congregation to capture your financial information, to provide my colleague, Paul Greer, not the Paul from the New Testament that Brett spoke of. We will ask Paul to gather that information, to give us a summary of how we are doing, how you are looking, say, with giving per age bracket. How are your 70 and 80-year-olds comparing to your 20 and 30-year-olds? We'll look at how many members do you have that are frankly giving zero to the ministry of the church, or are you overly reliant upon 1 to 2 to 3 families that are providing perhaps the sole source of income for that congregation? We look at that because the financial health is significant, regardless of what your decision is going to be. In the examples that I mentioned earlier, if you decide to sell, that's important. If you decide to age in place, it's also important. If you decide to merge with another congregation, it's important to know where you are. So regardless of the decision that you may reach at the end of our process, it is important, of course, to know where you are as a financial checkup. Sometimes we will make a health analogy that this report is kind of the diagnostics, and then we will come up with the treatment plan of deciding where to go from there. The next part of our gathering at our second meeting is that we introduce not only the results of that analytical data that we collected, but we also introduce the importance of a prayerful discernment model that right now we are using the Sailboat Church by former moderator Joan Gray. And if you're familiar with that piece, or if you're not, the Sailboat Church is a book where Joan Gray challenges us to answer, are we rowing as a church or are we sailing as a church? And using that analogy of the wind and equating that to the Holy Spirit, we should be aspiring to sail, to be more obedient to where the Spirit is leading us and less attached to where, as a result of our human effort, where we have gotten. And often, as we are struggling to maintain an edifice that is hundreds of years old in some cases, or things that are burdening us to care for, we begin to feel that maybe that is a rowboat decision. And that maybe if we are being more obedient to where the Spirit is leading us at this time with our ministry, that it may not be as attached to a physical plant. We also encourage the members to go through that prayerful discernment using more of a 40 days of prayer process. The second part of Joan's book is a daily guide to lead each member completing this process with us. Most of the time it's the session. Sometimes it is a leadership group that has been organized by the church. I've heard all kinds of cool names. It can be a Way Forward Committee, the Future Committee, the Vision Committee, all kinds of stuff that churches have come up with. But whatever committee that you have that I believe should be representative of your congregation, having those folks go through this process together is important. And as you're going through that 40 days of prayer, we've got to get back to the basics. We've got to get back to truthfully praying for our church. That may sound simple. It may sound like, of course, we are doing that. But truthfully, there are times where I'm really just not that sure. And so we are coming together as a body of leaders, literally praying for our church, 40 days together as a body of leaders coming together about where are we going at this particular time. And then it's kind of just watching God work and seeing as we come back together after that 40 days of prayer time, listening. I won't tell you that it's going to be a burning bush in the middle of your fellowship hall, but I will tell you that most of the time when I come together, I'm hearing all kinds of wonderful ideas and thoughts that have come up as folks have taken daily walks with God, or ended their day with a prayerful reflection of where God is leading their church at that time. And it's generally quite exciting just to see where congregations are really trying to go with their future ministry. We go back to those options at that point, and we start looking at, now that we've done this prayerful part, are there things that you feel drawn to, things that you never considered, or things that truthfully you know that will just not work for your ministry? Sometimes it's easier to say, I don't know what we're going to do, but I know we're not going to, sell the manse, or I know we're not going to merge with another congregation. I always feel compelled to quote Meatloaf when he says, I will do anything for love, but I won't do that. And so sometimes that's where you go. You look and say, what is that one thing that we're not going to do? Because sometimes that's the better way to approach that list of 7 options than to say, I think we're really drawn to that. I always try to caution folks, don't make that list of options that I gave you a multiple choice test. Don't go in with a preconceived notion of, this is what we need to do. I've been telling the session for years, and I'm going to go through this process because I already know the answer. That can be tempting, especially if it's our 3rd or 4th time on session or more. But generally, that's not helpful. It's not helpful for us to go in with that type of determination of, I think I already know the answer. What we have found to be more helpful is to go in saying, I have some thoughts, but I am willing to hear and respect the perspectives of my colleagues and know that I may not know the answer. I think we have countless examples in Old and New Testament that that's how it works. You may think you know the answer. You may be Jonah, and you might think you know what you're trying to do, and you might end up somewhere completely different. So I think it's best, of course, to go in, therefore, with an open mind, and the foundation will walk with you as you're processing that. It's a labor of love. We have had churches that have decided, this is the end of the road for us. But even in that decision, we've had churches that have created endowment funds that will pay out income to future ministries for ever and ever, amen. What the endowment funds will do with the foundation is that we pay into perpetuity. Our oldest fund goes back to 1821, and we're still creating new ones today. If you have not gone to our website, I would encourage you to do that. You will hear the story of many churches that have gone through property transformation, but one such story of an endowment would be St. Stephen's Presbyterian, that created an endowment out of their decision to close. And to this day, income is paid off of those endowments that they created into 4 or 5 different ministry areas, ranging from youth ministry to hunger, hunger assistance, all kinds of cool stuff. I personally have worked with 2 or 3 churches just in the past year that have created those endowment funds. And it has taken Olanda, the church boy, it has made my work feel sad as I'm watching ministries in, but also really embrace the power of resurrection, to know that there will be a new vision on the other side of that 3 days, that we will see a new ministry birthed as churches are creating new opportunities for ministries to come. As Deborah mentioned, our website is pretty easy to remember. It's just our name, presbyterianfoundation.org. And as you are there navigating to the project regeneration section of our services area, will take you to those videos when you will see stories. We've had other examples before Deborah brings the hook out and says I'm talking too much. We have had other examples where folks have decided to sell the property but remain a ministry. Sometimes that looks like, hey, let's sell our property and create an affordable housing complex. And within that structure, we will still have an active and vibrant ministry. There's a story on our website about that if you listen to the video for Astoria. I have worked with other congregations on the East Coast that have done similar. Most recently, Arlington Presbyterian and National Capital, they did very similar and has a wonderful structure of housing, but within that building, there's a floor for the church, and they minister to the community and have all kinds of outreach activities and all kinds of stuff. And they're not encumbered, as Brett mentioned, with our windows and leaky roofs and all that kind of good stuff, because that's no longer an issue. And they're able to focus strictly on where that ministry is leading. The key is not every church is the same. I can't tell you that that's your answer. It may not be affordable housing. It may not be an endowment. It may not be a merger, but it has to be something. When we're looking at some of these trends and troubling stats, not just of your church or presbytery, but truthfully our denomination, we've got to at least embrace doing nothing will give us the same results. So what is that something that we need to look at? That's something that we need to do that is perhaps a little bit differently, or perhaps it's pretty drastic, that will really change and shape the future of our ministry. And so if you're not in the great, wonderful, beautiful state of North Carolina, where I'm located, there is a ministry relations officer somewhere near you. We have a whole team of folks like me all across our denomination. The website also will help you. There's a locator where you can just put in your zip code and a name will pop up and you'll know who that person is. So happy to help you do this work and get involved.
Thanks, Oland. I have a few comments I want to make, but I want to encourage you. Some of you have already started posting questions in the chat. Continue to do that so I can pull up things that you want to ask Olanda or Brett or myself about this. I have two responses. One to Olanda. Art, you posted a question about what do we mean by intentional. PneuMatrix each year chooses a particular spiritual practice to focus on in our work as a consulting group. And this year's it's conscious intention. And we work on that not just amongst ourselves as a staff, but also with our clients on that. And I think that you really kind of heard around the edges, Olanda describe what conscious intention process is about. The 40 days of prayer, the Are We a Sailboat Church, the notions of saying, we don't want to drift towards something. Many of you who were on our first webinar with Jeffrey McDonald saw that I led with what I call the great 2x4. Paul Greer, along with the principals of PneuMatrix, were on a phone call a couple of years ago with Bill Drummond, who is the head of urban analytics at Georgia Tech and also an ordained Presbyterian minister. And we sort of said, you do this study for a living. You just did a big expensive study for the Lutheran Church. We just want the cheap and quick sort of answer of how do you see your own denomination moving out forwards in terms of decline? And he said, and we wrote it down and we've quoted him forever after, is if we do nothing different, by 2040, all of our churches that are now 100 members or less will be gone. And that's a 2x4 between the eyes. And we sort of, I always capitalize the do nothing different, because what our work is to say, let's take that intentionally conscious intention path of seeing whether there's something we can do that's different. And that's what this whole grant of designing for the new norm is about too. So I appreciate that, Olanda. I was going to say, we have the church I was with last night is on. They're suffering because the community has shrunk, because the Navy pulled out of a Navy base there on Mare Island. And so what they're looking at, though, is another model of a couple of other Presbyterian churches that are doing the tiny homes for veterans. And there's still a leftover sort of homeless veteran community, as we have all over the country now. And they're looking at using some of the acreage to do that. So there are things that come up to mind that are just really tapping into that ordination vow of serving with imagination or quite something. PneuMatrix uses a conscious intention process towards the end that that's called a hackathon. Some of you, if you've worked with us, you know what that is. It has nothing to do with your computer being hacked. It's I spent 20 years as a corporate chaplain in Silicon Valley and working with all of these new pop-ups. I mean, I remember the first meetings I went to, I had to say, excuse me, what is a CD-ROM? I'm that old. So it hadn't sort of yet been out in the public yet. But as I have grown with them, we've worked on the notion of how does innovation happen in a faithful context. And what began in Silicon Valley, what gave birth to things like Hewlett and Packard quitting Stanford and going into their garage and staying up all night, or the more modern next generation of that, of Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs doing the same thing. Of literally, if I get in my car and drive across the Golden Gate Bridge through San Francisco and down to Menlo Park, almost every skyrise in the city or office park on the road down to Menlo will have a logo on it that you'll recognize as an app logo that's on your smartphone. They were birthed here. And they were birthed in a methodology of what's called a hackathon. And what that is taking the improv mind, which is always yes and never yes but. So as Orlando was talking about the discernment process of don't get locked in to, to say, well, I already sort of see what we should be doing. It's sort of really to suspend that. And actually, neurologically, bioneurologically, it's the notion of forcing you a different quadrant of your brain to take over. One that we Presbyterians are not the most comfortable in. I often get very bold and say, that question of serving with energy, intelligence, imagination, love, Presbyterians are really good at 3 of them and we kind of suck at the 4th. And we do, but we're going to work on that 4th one and try to get into that part of our brain that says, what if? And if people can't get into the hackathonness of it, a hackathon is when the people who made all those apps on your phone hunkered down drinking Red Bull for 96 hours straight and came up with the next new billionaire app that they have. We're not looking for any billionaire apps, but we're looking for new ways to express the gospel of Jesus Christ in a secular increasingly secular culture in ways that get outside our walls. And so the buildings are the walls. And once we get out of them, we can find other ways to do that. And I often tell people, if hackathon's tripping you up, again, I'm pretty brash about things like this. I say, cross that out and write in crazy ass ways the Holy Spirit might want to do stuff here. And you'd be surprised how stuff just begins to flow. And you come up with a 1001 pilgrimage model. You come up with a tiny homes model. You come up with a model where we're going to sell our building and still exist somewhere as a nesting, aging group of people without a building, or maybe in the assisted living. I know of a church that did that. Most of their people were living in the same assisted living place eventually. So they sold the building. They continue to 2 things that people said, we want the minister who buries us to know us. And there's a very easy financial model in our presbyteries to make sure that chaplaincy happens with some of the assets that come out of sales of buildings. You can finance a presbytery position like that. Also, the notion of, they said, we want potlucks every once in a while in the assisted living. And most assisted living places, for instance, have an underused chapel. They would hold worship there. And then they would get involved in what they said, my grandchildren's version of ministry. And they'd start investing through stuff that they had at the Presbyterian Foundation and lodge there to be managed to fund the future. Those kinds of thinkings are exciting. The churches that are coming along that are deciding to transform the asset that they have had, that in some cases has become an albatross for them. It's like a family systems model. If we reach the point where maybe our aging parents, there's a broken hip or there's something that's happened that says you can't, that 2-story house that we all grew up in as kids isn't serving you well anymore. So let's find a different model of living in a different way. I think that the notion, though, of the intention is really saying, let's prayerfully look. I had one church I worked with in Cherokee Presbytery in Georgia. They said, well, our biggest asset as a church is we are really praying people. And I said, cool. So here's your homework for next month. It said, between now and then, pair up and 2 by 2, go into every room on your campus and sit and pray for an hour. And they came back with this incredible inspiration about things. They started turning, they said, what if we flipped some of the old Sunday school wing that doesn't have any kids in anymore into sliding scale counseling centers, for counseling to happen. They went through all these sorts of things. A church in Albany that I worked with decided to say, what if we became a halftime community center for the county and a halftime church? And they get to do both and the pastor, who would have been otherwise bivocational in a split way, is bivocational in a seamless way. She's the pastor of the church halftime, and she's halftime executive director of this nonprofit consortium that's using their building. So it's about the best and highest use in ways that say, pull back from our bigger campuses that sometimes are being underused and find ways of either living without them or in transforming how we use them. Brett, I wanted to mention in what you had talked about, I'm a Pilgrim girl. And I walked the Camino in high school when I was studying in Spain, and I've done Machu Picchu. I've gone to all the thin places I know of in the world at some point with folks, usually with a group of women that I've traveled with, and that I've been in the same prayer group with women for 30 years now. But what we did in and I can't even remember, I'm so old, I can't think of when it was, but I think it was in like the mid to late 80s when we did this, probably the late 80s. Grace Episcopal Cathedral in San Francisco, Lauren Artres was the new deaconess there. And she said, we were in a support group for sort of associate type pastors, and said, what if we get together and study what this, so many people in the Bay Area are what we now call the spiritual but not religious. They've left a Christian tradition they grew up in. They began searching Eastern religions, and to which I always say, shame on us Christians that didn't tell anyone in our communities that we have contemplative sides to our faith. They're very, very strong and original. So shame on us about that. So let's go learn about all those things together. And six of us got on an airplane, flew to Chartres Cathedral. And at the time we had to beg them to please move the chairs so we could walk on their labyrinth. And they looked at it like, what, why? What are you talking about here? That came back. They really weren't, they had no clue at that point. So the people that were around really had no clue the richness of what they had as an original labyrinth on the floor of the cathedral. We came back, built first on a canvas labyrinth, eventually a permanent labyrinth in Grace. Now there are 3 of them there. Now they're all over the country and the world, in hospitals, in prisons, in war zones. I will type in, as soon as I shut up, the source of all things labyrinth, veriditas.org. And it's all the how to make your own version, whether it's a rock or a canvas version or whatever you're doing. Greatest Eagle Boy Scout project in the world, if you need some help with it where you are. But those sorts of things, I know people who travel now to see other labyrinths all over the world as part of their focused pilgrimages. So it's a richness of addressing that group of nuns and duns, if you will, who used to maybe be with us or never grew up in a church tradition, but they want to sort of go on that journey of seeing what our faith is like. But it's a high ask to say someone, I think of this about all buildingless churches, it's a really high ask to say someone who's never been to a worship service in their life, unless it was a wedding or a funeral or something, to get up on a Sunday morning, God knows what they did the night before on Saturday, to figure out what to wear anymore, and to get up and walk into something called worship, and to sit down and then not to know when you're supposed to say anything, or when you're supposed to be quiet, or when you're supposed to stand or sit or kneel or whatever you're supposed to do. We put so many unknown burdens and blocks into people's lives who don't know what worship is. But that's because we're Sunday morning centric. If we can get out of that and see where people are, as Brett was saying, in the marketplace, there are great versions of ministry there, even if we think we have tired out and anything else. I put down The Sailboat by Joan Gray, so you know what, I'm not smart enough to go pull it off of Amazon and give you the link, but you can find it. It's an easy one to do. What is the website? Teddy, what is the website for what? For the labyrinth? Or maybe it's something I already answered. I'll put the Veritas thing in there. Other questions? Let's see what else we've got in here. I think that's it so far. Okay, we only have a few minutes left. Let me go back to you, Orlando, because I wanted to, Paul Greer, who is the, great all things real estate in my mind of being able to help you to assess things. He's good because he's the same person who come in and say, you want to do low income housing? Cool. You may or may not be the kind of location where that makes sense. And he'll be so real with you about examining that and examining. And God knows, he knows sort of more than anyone I know, sort of like that could work in Tennessee. It's never going to work in New York. It's like, all of the sort of complexity of things that need to be looked at. The resource of the foundations are just innumerous for you. And guess what? They're free. So that's the other thing we need to put in there, is that this is part of a service back to us. Are there any other questions that folks have about Buildingless Churches? Some of you, have any of you ever, are you looking at any right now in your own church setting of saying, we don't know whether we should sell, we should keep going, what we should do? Pardon me, I can't type and talk at the same time. That's the Labyrinth group, veriditas.org.
Deborah, there was also a question asking, besides Sailboat Church, are there other recommendations for reading or listening?
So my other passion in life, as Deborah knows, is dragon boat paddling.
Yeah.
I'm a dragon boat paddler. Dragon boat's a long canoe with 20 people who sit in it with a caller and a tiller. And I wrote an article in Presbyterians Today called Dragon Boat Church. I've actually been looking at Sailboat Church, and this is the other model in which we catch the current and we flow with the current and we move with the current, and there's a synchronicity. And what happens in dragon boat paddling, I've now done it for 6 years. There's a statement there's always the question here of dragon boat paddlers. How many paddlers are there in the boat? You say this to all 20 and you wait for the answer. And the answer is always one. There should be one paddler. There should be one. We should be so synchronous with each other. It is as if we are paddling as one. And that's when I made the connection with, we are the one body of Christ. One body, one spirit, one mind. We are part of that. And so for me, I'm going to just confuse things at Presbyterian Foundation so that you get to either be the Sailboat Church or you can be the Dragon Boat Church. It depends, because again, I had a fit of imagination, and that's why I'm writing the book. I've actually submitted a proposal to a certain Presbyterian publishing house called the Dragon Boat Church, based upon what I read in the Sailboat Church, because this is a more active model in which we work with the current, we move with the current, but we work together in that way. And that fits, again, back with the pilgrimage stuff. And I did take my husband one day. I took him off the honeymoon, and we went to Fatima up in outside of Lisbon, and went on pilgrimage, which was great. But I think what we're calling for is for a fit of imagination. And I liked Deborah's idea of people going around. There was a church and going around the rooms and asking, what else could we do here? There's a church on the Oregon coast. We're in the process of building what's called the Oregon Coast Pilgrimage, 350 miles on the Oregon coast. And one of the churches, Presbyterian, has now gone ahead and dedicated itself to becoming a hostel with showers and things like that. There are only 11 members of this church. And when they asked the community, do you want to support the church or do you want to support the hostel? The community came back saying, we'll support the hostel. We may not go to church, but we'll support the hostel. And so what's happening is, by supporting this hostel as a community on the Oregon coast, they may actually go to church as well. So I do think that that's where we need to be entrepreneurs, innovators, have a fit of imagination, sit down with the large canvases, the large newsprints of life, the whiteboards of life. And when we get to that crux where, where are we going next, if you will, to use the pilgrimage analogy, when we get to the crossroads, it's kind of like the Scarecrow in the Wizard of Oz. So we go there or there. We ask God, show us the way.
Mm-hmm. The imagination is, to me, has always been, I did my Duke dissertation on the imagination as the imago Dei in us. And I've always thought of it that way. And it takes us to wild and crazy places, which I happen to love. We have a minister colleague, and I'm blanking on her name. I so apologize now. Maybe one of you will remember it, who I read about first, and then I've seen her and heard her a few times since. She's sort of your average soccer mom looking minister from the Midwest, and she has a TikTok ministry with a following of over 300,000 people in what they are now forming as a church worshiping community of sorts. And she started it because she was bored during the COVID and said, our kids, my high school kids in our youth group, they're not going with the program of what we're doing. They're not youth program oriented anymore. I'm going to go study during COVID the world they live in. So she studied Instagram and she studied TikTok. And finally she said, I'm going to get brave. I'm going to look stupid, but I'm going to begin with one TikTok video that I'm going to post. And she had her robe on, and she had on a stole that was rainbow on one side and trans colors on the other. And she wrote, and she said, the cheesiest white girl rap that you've ever heard, she said. But the bottom line of it that she went on, it was her telling people, saying, if you're in a church where it was in a rap style song of, if you're in a church where they're telling you that you're going to go to hell, you walk out of that church right now. And she started talking about sort of God loves you and God takes you as you are. And she was sort of giving the alternative message. She ended up with this following, and she's had 4 million hits and 300 that follow her regularly and come back. At first they would peek in and they'd put like little messages like, a woman minister, with question marks. And then they'd put in like, does she know what those colors are that she's wearing? Does she have any idea? And she, it's like, and she'd answer back, yes, I do. And she would give the message of, I'm not going to let anybody tell my kids that they're going to go to hell, who are gay and lesbian kids or trans kids. And it just became this Pied Piperness of ministry that suddenly was at her feet. And now she's working on developing youth ministry by TikTok. All kinds of possibilities out there that find us sometimes if we're just doing that prayerful walk of discernment of what the heck can happen. And if we're at a stage where we don't know whether our church building that we are so in love with and put blood, sweat, and tears into is an asset or a liability to us, the answer is probably it's an asset if you think of it the way you need to broadly. And that it could include tearing it down. But if you think of it in the right context, faith-wise, it's probably always an asset of some sort or another. And it's the journey of looking to find out what that is the journey of buildingless faith churches. I thank you all for coming. I completely drive you towards the Dragon Road, which we'll look at for Westminster Press. I assume that's who you meant, coming out for the Dragon Boat alternative to the sailboat version. And because I both row and I sail, so I get the real difference in that one. Olanda, I hope you find our people still clicking in and finding both your videos, your modules, and that the phones start ringing to do some of your work, because man, you're the greatest, somewhat too secret asset sitting out there for all of us. I thank you all. Next week, tipping the scales, and we'll see you back then. This recording will be posted on the website that I linked us to. That both has the schedule, has the Zoom link, and has the posted videos on it. So that's the one to keep around. And I'll see you in a week. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.